Okay, we're live. Woohoo! Welcome, everybody. Just give it a minute. Okay, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're all tuning in from today. I'm coming to you live from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Welcome to NeuroAccess at Work, a podcast where we talk about all things neuroaccessibility and employment. Woohoo! So let's get into it. Today is going to be just a bit of a chat on what is neuroaccessibility. What does it even mean? Why is it important? I could talk about this for days, so trying to decide what to cover in today's session was a little bit challenging from an executive functioning lens, but I'm also neurodivergent. So it's not a webinar, so there won't be visuals like I usually do when I'm teaching this stuff, and feel free to join in. I love seeing the chat. If I don't get to it during the session, then I always go back and read it afterwards. So let's get into it. So what is neuroaccessibility? Well, I posted about neuroaccessibility for the first time in, I think it was January 2023. And the post I put up defined neuroaccessibility as neuroaccessibility is when the needs of neurodivergent people are specifically considered and products, services, environments, and systems are built or modified so that they can be used by people of all neurotypes. Now, we hear a lot about neuroinclusion, which is fantastic, and it's absolutely a goal that I think all workplaces should aim for and also try to actually achieve at some point. But neuroinclusion begins with access, because without access, there can't ever truly be neuroinclusion. And it's tricky because unlike more traditional accessibility that a lot of people first think of, including, ramps, captions, Auslan, those sort of things, accessibility for neurodivergent people is based on very invisible or non-apparent disabilities. And I must mention here, not all neurodivergent people identify as having a disability, but many of us do. So, before we get into it, I guess I have a bit of an example. So I've also got a physical disability, and it fluctuates in terms of my mobility, but I had a not great accident last year. Not really an accident, but I hurt my hip and I had to get hip surgery. And so over Christmas, when we visited family, I had a walking stick, and that was helping me get around. I didn't absolutely have to use it, but if I didn't use it, it was even harder to move. The difference between when I go out in public or the workplace or anywhere with something like a walking stick and when I don't is extremely vivid. When people see any sort of mobility aid or anything that can distinguish you as having any kind of extra or special needs or whatever you want to call it, or access needs, a lot of them, there's lots of reactions, right? But on a whole, most people are really caring and really want to help, and they'll go out of their way to at least make sure they're not intruding on you. When you don't have those things, though, there's nothing. It's just you are like everyone else. And that's problematic because we actually do need help, and we do need our support needs to be met or at least acknowledged. So basically, in terms of the background of how I came up to using neuroaccessibility, because before I defined it as this, and you might see it more these days, it was actually a neurology term to do with a medical thing. But I wanted to define it in more of a political term that could help people articulate their needs, because it is so difficult sometimes to do that. And I was seeing with a lot of my clients and experiencing myself quite the struggle with trying to communicate to people, well, what are your needs? What are your differences and how can we support you? And so much of the language in this space, and it's evolving, is focused on, the deficit model. It's very pathologizing. It's very much focused on the individual and not the environment. Lots of things that from the perspective of a professional advocate and lawyer just didn't really make sense to me. So anyway, I now teach organizations, employers and individuals all about neuroaccessibility, how to support their employees or how to self-advocate in workplaces, in all settings actually. And that was, I think, one of the key things here is that I'm probably not your traditional advocate in terms of having one area that I focus on, because I help people with employment and workplace stuff, but I also help people getting access to healthcare and advocating to medical professionals. And a lot of neurodivergent people do have complex health for various reasons. And I also help families advocate for education for their kids and adults at university and such. So the reason I do this is mostly because the skills that you need to advocate in any of these settings do cross over. And so you don't necessarily need to be a specialist in one area to know what the barriers are and how to articulate them and how to navigate systems. And so really that was what motivated me to deep dive into the language everyone was using and the best ways to communicate our struggles. And for me, I'm very passionate about the social model of disability and the neurodiversity paradigm, and making sure everyone feels seen and heard. And I was just really keen to find a way to help people understand that. Anyway, that's a little background. But yeah, why is it important? So neuroaccessibility is crucial, in my opinion, as it ensures that neurodivergent individuals who may process information and perceive the world differently can fully participate in various aspects of life, including work, education, and social activities. I mean, that's a given, right? I don't think we need to explain that anymore. But by adapting environments and practices that do meet these diverse cognitive and sensory needs, it really does promote inclusivity. It enhances productivity. It fosters a sense of belonging and well-being for everyone, not just neurodivergent people. And it truly is essential for a more equitable and understanding society, which is, I think, what everyone is really headed towards. And if you're not, you should be. I'm probably not the person to listen to. Anyway, if you're tuning in on this live, do pop in the comments. Let me know where you're coming from. Are you neurodivergent? Are you an employer? Are you a support person? Support professional? Love to know those things. Anyway, so I guess I don't really like to focus too much on the why we should prioritize neuroaccessibility at work. Just because for me it's just such a given, but I'll do a really quick one because a lot of people like that stuff and it's uplifting and motivating. So, I mean, it enhances innovation and creativity. It increases employment engagement and satisfaction. You get a broader talent pool, improved productivity, legal compliance and risk reduction. That's a big one that sometimes is glossed over in these things. Positive organizational reputation. So there's the ethical and moral element, building an inclusive culture, reflecting societal values. And I mean, what more do you need? There's a million reasons why we should all be prioritizing neurodiversity, neuroaccessibility. For those of you who are unfamiliar, and I guess I do expect a level of basic knowledge here, but to be more specific, someone who identifies as neurodivergent can be autistic, ADHD, dyslexic. They're the main ones that you'll hear about, but anyone with an acquired or born with mental health condition or cognitive differences, it's really broad, and I highly recommend checking out Sonny Jane Wise because their work is incredible. And They're a good friend, and you should definitely buy their book. I was recently in Sydney helping them launch their book, which was awesome. And we were in a bookstore with this beautiful audience of mostly neurodivergent adults, and it was just colourful and magical and such a bonding neurokin moment. Anyway, I digress. But yeah, that's neurodivergent. Neurodiversity, a lot of people get confused with neurodivergent and neurodiversity, but neurodiversity is the concept that essentially all brains belong and have value. So you can't have neurodiversity. You also can't technically be neurodiverse, although that's popularly interchanged with neurodivergent for people who maybe don't quite understand the origin of the language. But Sonny's book is actually called We're All Neurodiverse, and what that means is that collectively we are a neurodiverse population, like group, humanity, whereas individually you are or you are not neurodivergent. And if you're not neurodivergent, which is about 20% of the population, then you can be, the terms commonly used are neurotypical or neuronormative. I think the thing to be mindful of here, because people can get a bit defensive when they think they're called neurotypical, is that it's not typical in terms of like there is a normal or typical brain, but it's just that your brain and bodily functioning is more typical in terms of what is considered norm in our society and what our society is built around. And so you have less barriers. So, for example, if we were all in wheelchairs, then I don't think being in a wheelchair would be a disability, because the world would literally be built for people in wheelchairs. But because it's not, and that it's a minority, they have a disability that needs access support, right? So it's similar for neurodivergence. Just for neurodivergence, it's highly invisible. And a lot of stigma comes with that, like it does with mental health. So, for example, I recently had a CPAP study, bit of a TMI, but we should definitely destigmatize talking about sleep apnea. And I was at the hospital getting fitted for a mask and checking what titration I needed. And the nurse said to me, she made a joke about how some people can't stand the masks with the tubing here because they can hear the rush of wind, of air past their ears. And they say to her, like, I couldn't possibly sleep like that. And she sort of rolled her eyes and scoffed and said, how ridiculous. And I thought to myself, this is actually a really good example of some of the barriers that neurodivergent people come across, because we all have very different inputs and learning and all of that, it's really hard for a lot of people to truly understand some of the barriers that we face. So for that example, I'm sure there are some people that would have made those kind of comments that maybe they were just being, just a bit hyperbolic, or assuming that would be hard, and maybe it actually wasn't that bad for them. But there are absolutely people that would never be able to sleep with that kind of noise rushing past their ears, who had the most severe sensory sensitivity, that would be a huge barrier to sleep, to accessing sleep. And I use that as an example because this is where the nuance comes in, right? Like, not everyone needs meeting notes beforehand, but some people, it's the difference between them being able to attend or not, or to attend with such severe anxiety that it drains their system of being able to do literally anything else. And that's really, I guess, where the importance comes down to it, in terms of recognizing the nuance in our functioning capacity and our ability to process the world, and understanding that just because you don't have an issue with it doesn't mean someone else does. But a great example of this in my everyday life, that I hear from a lot of my clients as well, is in relationships and such, is my partner doesn't have a very sensitive sense of smell, and I have a extremely sensitive sense of smell, which can both be helpful and frustrating. So whenever something smells in our house, which of recent years has been my son's nappy, it's extremely overwhelming for me, and I need it to be fixed ASAP. And not just because it's uncomfortable or I don't like it, but it's so jarring that it's actually painful. And he always thinks like, or he says to me like, oh, don't be silly, it's fine. And he knows, like, we've been together 14 years. We just celebrated our 10-year, wedding anniversary. He absolutely knows about my sensory needs, and he supports my access in every possible way. But even he forgets that just because he smells it differently doesn't mean I shouldn't have a problem with it either. And so one of the challenges in terms of being an employee who is neurodivergent and trying to have their access needs met is really articulating what their struggles are, and then on top of that, how it can be helped. Because oftentimes when we speak up about our struggles, the first response we get is, well, what can we do about it? And that's a whole nother layer. Not many of us without support or, having done a lot of sort of in-depth work to figure out these things, can then articulate this a solution. And it's often an ongoing conversation. And I guess that brings me to another point, which is to be neurodivergent and identify as a person with disability is often, it's more common that you have a dynamic disability. So let's say it's psychosocial, and you have depression, and you go through periods of very severe depression, and then you go through periods of maybe you come out of the depression. Anyway, it's just a helpful example. But for me and a lot of my clients who are mostly autistic and ADHD, it's a matter of some days having more spoons, I like to say, if you've heard of spoon theory, or more capacity, and other days having less. And that can be another challenge for neurotypicals or allies to understand, because one day we might really need a lot of support and the other day we don't. And then the day that we go back to needing more support is the day that we get the reaction like, but you could do it yesterday. What's the problem? And there's not always a solution. There's not always an easy answer to that. And that's another really complex area to navigate. Anyway, let's get back on track. Okay, so the biggest challenges facing employees, which I think I've already kind of covered, but we'll just go through. Fear of disclosure is a huge one. That's, often many people who do disclose that they're neurodivergent do face really negative repercussions, including stigma, discrimination, bullying, sometimes even job loss. And so that can be a real preventative in terms of, to be able to access help and self-advocate and speak up, we need to be able to actually articulate these things and feel safe enough to share them. So that's like baseline, right? Lack of awareness and understanding. So many people have such poor understanding of, the language around neurodiversity and disability that it can be really hard because you just don't know who you're going to come across that maybe has a lot of knowledge and it's really easy, or has had no previous exposure, and you've got to do the educating, and that puts a lot of pressure, especially on people with any sort of neurodivergence that has communication barriers. For instance, a lot of autistic people will really struggle with that. I mean, navigating this world as an autistic people is hard enough, let alone then having to explain it to people constantly. And I mean, that's my job for a living. And even in my everyday life, on a personal level, I still find that quite draining. Happy to do it on a professional level, but when you're talking to, your family friend and they've found out about what you do and they want to grill you on what does it all mean, and specifically to you, it's quite intrusive. And that's something to be mindful of as well, especially if you want to be a really well-meaning ally and you start asking lots of questions. I would absolutely recommend going to do your research, and specifically researching from lived experience, and not necessarily just what Google or ChatGPT shoots out, because as of currently the 1st of March, ChatGPT is pretty terrible in terms of explaining the correct language usage, or not correct, but the preferred language usage, and all of that jazz. So we've talked about variable needs, so a dynamic disability, an invisible, non-apparent. What about so difficulty in identifying specific accommodations. That is really challenging because, and it's actually one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of when I get asked to speak by organizations, giving them a big list of how you can accommodate your autistic or ADHD employees or colleagues, because within the neurodivergent population, there's so much difference and diversity. So even if we have the same identity or the same diagnosis, doesn't mean we're going to have the same accommodation needs. For example, let's say I'm one of the autistic people and I have very sensitive hearing, and maybe I need to wear headphones or work from home, or maybe not work in an open plan office. And then next to me is my autistic mate who has no problems with hearing or those sort of sensory issues. Maybe they have no sensory issues or other sensory issues that they struggle with and need access support with. And so if you come in thinking that all autistic people need hearing help, like help with that sense or sensory issues in general, because some of us have quite severe sensory differences and some have quite mild, then you're starting out from a place of assumption and a place where we're going to have to work even harder at breaking down those biases and assumptions. So I think keeping an open and curious mind and always being led by the individual is really an important point. We've already touched on communication barriers and concerns about job security and career progression. Disabled people are not only extremely unemployed, but they're also underemployed, meaning they're in jobs well below their qualification level or their ability. And that can also be a result of stigma, discrimination, and other barriers. And that applies for neurodivergent people as well. Navigating bureaucratic processes. This is one of my favorite topics in terms of what just frustrates me personally in my own past experience of employment, but also in helping a lot of my clients. If you're an Australian public servant, then you probably know what I mean, but our bureaucratic processes are not neuroaccessible at all. I only left the public service just over 2 years ago when I started my business, and honestly it was one of the most relieving aspects, was just not having to do all the bureaucracy around forms and PFADs or whatever you call your performance reviews. And just if there's one place to start looking in terms of creating a more neuroaccessible environment, look at your forms, look at your leave and your performance and all of that, and start adapting it and making it more flexible and understanding of neurodivergence, because currently most workplaces are not. And I'm looking at you, HR and DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging professionals, who are really the people who are going to champion this change, if anyone, hopefully, and take the burden off the individuals having to fight for it, both for themselves, and many neurodivergent people are really, really passionate advocates trying to help their workplaces really evolve and be better for all neurodivergent people, not just themselves too, which is beautiful. Limited support system, that can be really challenging, whether it's within the workplace or external supports. This is a big one that I see with NDIS participants. The NDIS like to know who's supporting you, family, friends, whatnot, and sort of work your plan around that. But there's so many different barriers and challenges that can come up in terms of having those supports. But without allies and advocates pushing for necessary change, feels very overwhelming. Cultural and organizational resistance. This is something that we see in all change, but in the diversity space, we've absolutely seen it in terms of the LGBTQ community. A lot of people being very resistant to changes in pronouns, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because even if it's something that you're not used to, it's something that values the identity and autonomy of that individual. So autistic people are not the only ones that are bad at change, and we're not bad at change. I'm making a joke, but not everyone, but it's common to criticize the autistic community that they don't like change, but I think all humans are resistant to change, and maybe autistic people are just a bit honest about it. Anyway, yeah, then there's the mental and emotional toll, which we've kind of touched on. But yeah, it's very hard to self-advocate, especially in a unsupportive environment. Sorry. I should have turned my notifications off. Distracting, ADHD. Anyway, so what are the biggest challenges for employers? That's an important one, because employers really do hold so much of the power, and it's without identifying these things, it's really hard to give them solutions to be able to change and make their workplace better. So a lack of awareness and understanding, that's a big one. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of large organizations out there that are sort of the go-to in this space that are giving not so helpful advice, especially around neurodiversity and the neurodivergent population. So be really careful on where you're getting your education from. Hiring consultants and lived experience experts, I think, is so much more powerful than maybe going for the more corporate, bigger places that maybe don't prioritize lived experience, or at least don't listen to lived experience, which is very problematic. The invisible nature, or a lot of us prefer to use non-apparent because it's not invisible if you look hard enough, of being neurodivergent can make it really hard for employers to identify who in their organization needs that extra support, or who to approach in terms of providing neuroaccessibility, variability of needs. I mean, these are all the same things we've talked about in terms of what's challenging to the individual. But I think a big concern is cost when I talk to employers, but the majority of the access supports are really cheap or free. So I don't think cost is a very valid concern for not building a neuroaccessible and inclusive workplace. And I think potentially the concern there comes from, again, a lack of awareness and education around what those kind of supports can be. But it's really important. And the other thing to think about here is legal and compliance issues. So obviously we've got disability rights and employment law, and employers do have obligations to comply with. But if anything, this should be a positive towards trying to create a more neuroaccessible workplace, because you're literally doing what you're required to do. And that's becoming better known slowly. Success and impact. Okay. Sorry, I'm going off a list. Usually I'm more conversational. If you're in the chat or viewing, drop a line, say hi, where you're tuning in from. Let me know if any of this resonates, if you're a neurodivergent employee or employer or ally. Okay, so let's talk about it. What can you do to improve or seek help? That's a big one. And again, I could spend all day just on this topic. But workplace assessments is very important. And I'm not talking about assessing the individual and what their deficit is. I'm talking about, and I did quote unquote there for anyone who's not watching, I'm talking about accessibility audits, conducting comprehensive evaluations of the physical and digital workplace environment, to identify barriers that may be impacting your neurodivergent employees. Sensory environment analysis is also a really helpful one. So, checking things like lighting and noise levels, spatial design, and, thinking about what adjustments you could make to create a more sensory friendly workplace. And on the flip side of that, if for some reason you're in a workplace that maybe it's really not that easy to make those changes, then it's about thinking about, well, what are the alternatives? Because there's always alternatives, whether that's allowing your neurodivergent employees to work from home, maybe to work from home part of the time. There's usually multiple options. It's really just a matter of being creative and thinking outside the box. Training and workshops are a really good one. I obviously do these for a living, so I talk to a lot of neurodiversity resource groups in organisations, both corporate and government. They're really growing, which is beautiful to see, because I think there's nothing more powerful than gathering a community of neurokin together who can share lived experience and talk about what their challenges and their successes are. But I think training and workshops can be really valuable for leaders, can be really valuable for colleagues and allies. Sadly, right now, I'm seeing more of it targeting, and not sadly because it's a good thing, but sadly in terms of I don't think it's wide enough. It's barely the bare minimum, is in having the more popular training and workshops to go towards people who are already neurodivergent. That's important because they need training in self-advocacy and support in all of that. So I'm really passionate about that, but I would love to see organisations taking a bigger stance on professional development for everyone in the workplace, whether that's HR, whether that's leaders, whether that's just all colleagues, because really, in order to understand these things and create organisational change and meaningful change, we need everyone to get on board. And that applies to all diversity and understanding that just because you don't identify with a group doesn't mean you shouldn't, take the initiative to learn about them and try and be more inclusive. Anyway, so policy design, policy development, consultation are a big one. Trying to update your policies to be more inclusive, and your best practice guidance, that's super important. Customized accommodation strategies. So with this, and I was talking about this a little bit before in terms of how I don't like to give a list of accommodations for fear of people sticking to that and not continuing to have an open and curious mind for each neurodivergent individual. But I think it is helpful to an extent to have more broad accommodations, like common accommodations that can help neurodivergent people, and that's all neurodivergent people, but then equally understanding that you then have to take it to that next step of just focusing on the individual because we are just so diverse. And obviously flexible work arrangements are a big one. Whether it's remote working, flexible hours, customized workspace, it's honestly one of the most powerful things. A lot of us can struggle with things like getting to work on time. So sometimes even just having a workplace that is okay with you not starting on the dot of 9, and okay if some days you start earlier and some days you start later, and maybe your team just has an agreement that they don't book meetings before 10, 10:30, 11. And this helps everyone, okay? So this helps carers, this helps parents, this helps literally anyone who needs flexibility. And that applies to most of this. It's not just neurodivergent people. And equally, even if you're not neurodivergent, you can benefit from a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of access needs. And I think that if we all got more comfortable talking about all these different things, it would make the world a better place. Another thing to think about is technology and tools. I'm a huge fan of assistive technology. I use so much of it for myself in my own business, but I also help a lot of clients use it in everyday life, in their workplace. And I think that this is really underrated in terms of employers trying to get support for, and thinking outside the box of what kind of assistive tech could work. Support systems and networks. Again, the employee resource groups are great. Mentoring programs would be great to see more of beyond the resource group where, you pair neurodivergent employees, maybe at different levels, or even allies and mentors, people that they just know are safe to go to and ask advice and feel supported. So important. Continuous improvement and feedback loops are another big one. So many organizations will do the mandatory performance reviews every 6 to 12 months. And it's just really not helpful in terms of being able to feel comfortable checking in on a more regular basis and adapting to having changing needs. So if you do have neurodivergent employees, then that's something to really think about, is how can you fill the gap between the feedback loops that are the more traditionally set in stone ones, because that can be a huge barrier. And obviously compliance and legal advisory, get the advice that you need for risk management, workplace health and safety. I have seen a bit in the WHS space that is starting to recognise and articulate neurodivergence and what that looks like from a WHS perspective. So definitely, check that out. Anyway, what else should we talk about? We got a few tuning in. Chuck in the comments where you're coming from, what you're resonating with. If you have any questions, this is a live podcast, so it's your opportunity to ask me anything. So I'm happy to answer it, and just know that we are streaming on 3 different platforms. So I think some of them are a little bit more comment heavy than others. Anyway, but yeah, this is fun, getting to talk about one of my favorite topics. And for anyone who tuned in late, like I said at the beginning, this is very intro based, because neuroaccessibility, I could literally run a multiple week course on it. There's just, it's so complex. There's so many layers, and that's just, for one audience. If that's, helping neurodivergent people self-advocate and set themselves up, helping employers become neuroaccessible and what that looks like. There's so many different layers in terms of understanding what it means and how to support our beautiful community. Anyway, also sometimes the comments, I use a special platform that feeds me the comments from all different platforms, and it's a little temperamental. So if you have done a comment and I haven't brought it up, I'm sorry, and I will look at it afterwards and I'll comment on it. Anyway, so self-advocating framework. One of my biggest passions is helping neurodivergent people build their self-advocacy skills, because I think that's just so powerful and so important on a day-to-day basis. And so really the first level of that is self-awareness. So understanding your own neurodivergence and identifying what your access needs are. That's like game zero. You have to start there. Then I guess you can look into learning things, including, what is neuroaccessibility? So learning about common accommodations and supports that can help you, maybe looking at other people similar to you and what they've used, or doing more case study research on different workplaces, educational institutions and public spaces, or coming and having coaching sessions with me so I can help you figure that out, because it's what I do. And staying informed on just new technologies and tools and strategies. And this is a very fast moving area. It's fresh, it's new, and so much is coming out, which is so exciting. But it can also be quite overwhelming for people who are newer to, everything. There's so many, especially in the current workforce, there's so many people being late identified and late diagnosed, that, when it first happens, you're just like, where do I start? Start here. Community engagement, so engaging with your workplace neurodiversity network if they have one. If they don't, talking to HR and such about creating one, because if you're there, I guarantee there's a lot of others that are there that want one and don't even know that they can. Connecting on forums. I have a network. It's not quite open to the public. It's only open to my current and past clients, but it's going to be opening in the next month or so, called the NeuroAccess network. And it's a space where neurodivergent people can come and share their stories, ask questions, get help, feel validated, which is hugely underrated in terms of an access need, and learn from peers, which is so powerful. And then I guess it's really learning how to articulate their needs, whether that's, the language used or the means of communication. There are so many different ways you can go about that, and everyone has different levels of comfort. So some people might be okay using mouth words or speaking their communication words, their communication needs, but access needs. I've been in meetings all morning, so my tongue's getting tired. Which is a communication, sometimes access need that I need. Oh, Narissa, sorry if you've covered this. I got in late because LinkedIn Live didn't work for me. Oh, I hope that you're the only one, Narissa. That's okay. What do you think the most powerful first step would be for promoting neuroaccess in the workplace? Great question, Narissa. I did sort of briefly cover that, but I'm happy to dive in. And this is the advantage of any of you that do come live, is you can totally basically have a conversation to me live. So I will go over that because it's so important and I don't think anyone can hear it enough. So I hope the platform's still working. Anyway, first step would be, and this obviously depends on you and the workplace, but let me just make some basic assumptions that maybe your workplace doesn't currently have a neurodiversity network or any sort of employee resource group. That would be where I would almost start. At the same time, it depends where you are on your journey. So if you're in a place where maybe you're doing okay at work or they're pretty inclusive and accessible, that's also where I would say start. But if you're in a place where you're burnt out, you're newly diagnosed, you don't know where to start, you like your job, you want to stay there, but you just need help to basically be able to, which is probably more common in what I see in my own clients than the latter, then before diving into trying to get the workplace to build a neurodiversity network and such, which is so powerful and important, probably start more from the basics of your particular area. So, talking to your boss about your neurodivergence. If you're not even at that stage, and I know I'm going backwards here, but neurodivergent minds can be beautiful things, and definitely non-linear. But going a step back from that, again, if you're even earlier in your journey, if you're not even comfortable, I get a lot of people coming to me who are like terrified of disclosing their neurodivergence at work. And so if you're at that level, I would be seeking out help in any way possible, whether you're maybe an NDIS participant, if you're in Australia, using your NDIS plan to access supports, including careers coaching or employee access coaching. I have quite a few NDIS clients who do coaching with me, and I help them not only go through the process that I went to earlier, which you might have missed, Narissa, which was I was still going through it, the self-advocacy framework that I have, where you start off with the basics of really just self-awareness of understanding your neurodivergence and your needs specifically, learning what you can do about it, connecting with community, articulating those needs, advocating, and then implementing supports, which are all very different levels. And then I guess you get to institutional engagement. So it's a bit hard for me sometimes because when the work that I do with organizations are at that level of they are in the phase of the institutional engagement aspect, whereas when I work with individuals, we're usually way back at the start, well before we start getting their workplace to engage on a bigger level. So I think that's probably why I started up there and started taking it back. But really, it can be so hard to identify what your access needs are, and it can really help having a third party, whether that's a trusted friend, an accessibility professional like myself, especially one who specializes in neurodivergence, because so many accessibility supports or disability supports are for more traditional disability and physical access needs rather than neurological. Having someone to help you unpack that can be very helpful, but then that's just the first layer, because once you sort of lay out what are all your struggles, then it's about, well, what can you do about them and how do we approach the workplace, whether that's HR or your boss, your immediate boss or your bigger boss. Again, a lot of it does depend on individual circumstances. But if you wanted to promote NeuroAccess at your workplace and in general, in the bigger sense, so maybe you're a neurodivergent person who's kind of got your head around it, you've maybe done a lot of things to help your own access, maybe you've talked to your workplace to get support, I would definitely be leaning into trying to develop some kind of neurodiversity network. I speak to these kind of networks all the time. I'm speaking at AstraZeneca in a week. I spoke at, who else? ACCC recently, an international engineering firm, law firms, and there's different levels of it too. So there's just the one-off kind of speech that it's more usually around celebration days or specific events. But then there's also there's bigger work that can be done, and the workplaces that do this are some of my favorite, but they go deeper than just that initial session, which is really important, especially for the widespread awareness and education. But, getting professional development for their leaders, having professional development for their neurodivergent staff, because oftentimes it can be really helpful for the neurodivergent staff themselves to get that help, and then they can take that back not only to their own workplace but to the organisation, and building that network and community and all the resources that everyone can dip into. I hope that answers your question, Narissa. Thank you for that. Anyway, so yeah, I was almost finished with my advocacy framework, but then you get down to building self-advocacy skills and allyship, implementing supports. That's a big one because a lot of people think that you find out what your needs are, you find out what supports could work for those specific needs, and then you're good. But that's rarely how it works, especially for neurodivergents who tend to have more than one kind of neurodivergence. So autistic, ADHD, maybe you've got PTSD. They rarely come in single form. And so implementing the supports once you've identified what your needs are and what could help is really quite a journey in terms of trial and error, having that continuous feedback loop, knowing that you're going to be supported even when it fails, knowing that sometimes it will work and others it won't, as I said earlier about the dynamic element of this disability and how neurodivergent needs can be variable and fluctuate. All things to keep in mind in terms of when you are up to the point where you're ready to start implementing your access supports. And that's when, once that's all going well and you're feeling better and maybe not so burnt out and that you've got capacity, looking into expanding into the institutional engagement. So you've got the resource groups, the employee resource groups. You've got influencing policy, maybe looking at your workplace's policies and how they can maybe be a little bit more inclusive. And if that's overwhelming, because some people don't have that experience or just don't maybe find that very interesting, which is all valid, then suggesting to your HR or leadership that getting an outside person who can look at those policies, and I promise I'm not just self-promoting, but this is the kind of thing that can really help, is having someone to come in, assess their policies, find the gaps, help increase the inclusive language. And again, it's not even just on neurodiversity and neurodivergence, it's on all kinds of diversity. Are they LGBTQ friendly? Are they culturally and linguistically diverse, inclusive? There's so much more than one kind of diversity. And the thing I love about being a neurodivergent advocate is that neurodivergence intersects on every part of humanity. So it doesn't matter what sexuality, race, gender, anything that you are, we all have neurodivergence within our communities, and in a much bigger way than I think a lot of people realize. If you didn't know, for autism specifically, a study came out last year saying that 80% of autistic girls or female identifying autistic people are still not identified when they leave school at 18. 80%. So our assumptions on, I think the most current Australian business ABS stats on neurodivergence is something like 1 in 8. I see stats overseas and online and different studies going more to 1 in 5, so about 20% of the population. But if we understand how limited the DSM is and how much bias there is in terms of historical, gender, all the racial, there's still going to be a huge amount of people that are not even identified, It's not even on their radar, but they're walking around there being neurodivergent, needing access supports and struggling. And that's not fair. And maybe you were one of them. I wasn't diagnosed till I was 28, 5 years ago. And I tell you, I spent almost a decade in the workforce desperately trying to find support and not realizing why I found things that other people seem to not really think about so difficult. A story that I like to bring up, it's a little one, but it deeply resonates with a lot of my coaching clients and usually opens the floodgates to their own experiences. But when I was a brand new grad, fresh out of law school, one of the jobs I went into, it needed, sorry, someone's trying to call me. One of the jobs I went into was, it had a lot of engagement. So I needed to make phone calls. I needed to be across what other teams were doing and clients and such. And I don't like phone calls. Never have, never will. I do not do phone calls unless they're absolutely necessary. And any of my clients will know this. I also am not a huge fan of emails, but you have to choose something, right? And I've got a lot of assistive tech that helps me with emails. So anyway, back to the point. So yeah, I was really distressed one day because I had to find out information from this other team who was not near us. They were in the same building, but far away. I'd never met them. And, if you're listening to this and you're resonating, I'm sure some of you can understand the anxiety of having to talk to new people or people that don't know you and all of those things. I mean, a lot of us do have a lot of trauma in our histories. But I asked my supervisor if I could just send them an email. And he looked at me like I told him chocolate was blue. And he said, "Oh, don't be ridiculous, call them." And in that little conversation, what I was trying to get, and this is, again, down to learning, how to articulate yourself and how to influence communication and such. But what I was trying to say was, I really don't want to call them. Can I email them because it would really help my stress levels and my communication access needs? But because I didn't say that, he didn't think that that was a thing for me, which is really one of the biggest challenges that neurodivergent people have, is that people just don't think. If you don't experience it, it's really hard to think of how it would affect you. Just like I don't really care what pronouns people use for me, but that's not because I don't care about pronouns. I do, but I have not got the non-typical pronouns. I'm she, her. So I don't really understand how it could affect it. Now, I've done a lot of research and I've listened to so many of my beautiful friends who are trans and non-binary and all different genders talk about how that kind of thing impacts them. So little plug, next Friday, tickets haven't gone out yet, but they'll be going out in the next, probably by this afternoon. I'm doing a co-hosted panel with Australian Neurodivergent Parents Association for International Women's Day next Friday. So stay tuned on my socials to get tickets to that. And they will be low cost and sort of as inclusive as we can possibly make them. Now I've forgotten my point, which happens a lot. And usually if I'm talking to neurodivergent people, they all laugh and smile and they get it. Oh, I got a thumbs up. Woohoo. Anyway, so yeah, it's the little things. Someone remind me what I was talking about. Yeah, the phone call and how that was really hard. Anyway, I think to go full circle until it comes back to me, because 90% of the time it'll come back to me. Thank you, brain. More so if I'm not stressed that it's gone in the first place, which can really kind of be dependent on the audience. But to go full circle, I think one of the hardest things in self-advocating as a neurodivergent person and having your access needs met is being able to find the language to say what your needs are. And so having a diagnosis or identifying with a neurodivergent identity can be the very first step to finally finding answers and language that you can use. And that's so powerful. So many people you'll hear who are late diagnosed, just the relief that they felt not only because they found their community, but they found the language that explained their very unique lived experience. And then on top of that, maybe helped communicate that to other people who just couldn't really understand some of their different behaviors or experiences. But, you know, little grad me would have very much liked the ability to go into that new job and make it quite clear from day one, when maybe they asked what my communication preferences were, that I'd prefer to do more email than phone call. And this is like quite a sensitive area, because a lot of people will prefer to talk about it in terms of preferences, which I think is sometimes really helpful, because a lot of people don't want to talk about it in more of a clinical or pathologizing, there's the word, way. But preferences are different to access needs. And the difference being that a preference can still be really beneficial, but an access need is the difference between being able to do something and not. And I don't mean as in I made that phone call and I can make that phone call, but there's a hidden cost that people don't see. And that cost is always different, obviously, but in this case, severe anxiety, a completely wound up nervous system, a complete lack of capacity to do anything else for the rest of that day, including feed myself, do any kind of stuff when I get home in terms of keeping a household. And so we spend all our energy masking at work and not wanting to be, you know, judged or stigmatized or discriminated against. And the outcome for that is so many of us are ending up late diagnosed and in severe burnout. Why do we have to completely break to get identified? Why are we not identifying neurodivergence as early as possible and in a more neutral light, not just deficit-based or delays? And speaking of International Women's Day next week, and AMPA, which is the Australian Neurodivergent Parents Association, they're doing some incredible advocacy work on the Inklings program right now, which is essentially identifying babies and toddlers for disability, mostly autism, but disability. And it's been done in a way that certainly hasn't taken on board lived experience and the community's views. And I say community as in neurodivergent community, not parents of, not that their views aren't valid, but these things have to be done in a holistic way. And yeah, I really recommend looking into that and supporting AMPA in their accessibility and advocacy journey. I'm a huge fan, hence why I'm getting on board and helping them any way I can. Anyway, another thing you might have seen on my socials, yesterday I announced that I'm the new chair of Enabled VIP, which is an incredible online platform that specifically helps disabled people like myself, and that includes neurodivergent people, access work, and specifically around gig-based work, hobbyists, solopreneurs, small businesses. We have a really long way to go in terms of disability and neurodivergent employment inclusion in the more traditional workplaces especially. And so for some people, and this goes back to your question, Narissa, around what to do first in the workplace, is some people really get to a point where they realize that no matter how much I try, this isn't for me. And I was one of them. And now I actually teach workplaces, which is hilarious. But some people do really just need the autonomy and control and flexibility that working for yourself gives. So I'm very passionate to be joining the Enabled VIP team. And I hope you enjoyed today. If you're watching on replay or live, thanks for joining in. I know it was a little bit rambly because I usually have a guest on these podcasts. And if you haven't checked out my last podcast, which I promise I still have season 2 coming, it's all ready to go. I just have to upload it. It's called Princess in the Pea, which was my nickname as a child because I was sensitive in every way, and an affectionate nickname from my parents. And so, yeah, I made a podcast about it where I interview mostly female identifying autistic ADHDers, but some allies and a mixture, because there just can't be enough content out there. And I think neurokin and community connection is really, really powerful. So I'm going to wrap it up there, but thank you for joining. And if you're catching this up, do drop me a line and let me know how you found it. And I'm happy to do more. I actually, if I get enough feedback, then I might do a free webinar in the coming weeks or months that dives a bit deeper into neuroaccessibility in terms of getting into the more practical strategies. So do let me know on whatever platform you're on, or shoot us an email at info@anniecrowe.com.au or on any of my socials or Linktree. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend. And thanks for being here.